Good morning, Ed. Welcome.
Thank you. Sorry to be delayed here.
No, it's all right. So we have, so are we online?
Yeah.
Hey guys, so welcome to the TB Care 2 Infection Control webinar, which will be hosted by Dr. Ed Nardell. So I think without any additional discussions, I welcome Ed to start the presentation.
Niraj, am I controlling the slides here? Or
Yes, you should be. Can you just try?
Click to start the remote control on the slide.
I think you need to go to the...
Yep, you're in control.
Yeah, we can see you moving. So
Okay.
I think with your up and down, page up and down.
Okay, so I just need to get back to presentation mode. Here it is. I see it.
Yeah. Yes, so you're in control. Yep.
Okay. All right. Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. And it's good to have an opportunity to review some of the current thinking on TB transmission control. And I'll try to keep this within a half hour, a little bit more, so that we have time for discussion. What you see in front of you is a schematic sort of showing just as a circle, a source of infection, and on the other circle on the other side, a host. And so the circles represent the areas where TB infection control can be implemented. The big blue circle in the middle is the environment where the organisms are being transmitted through the air. And in the boxes are, square boxes are the interventions one can make. So if we begin with the infectious source, the patient with often undiagnosed, unsuspected tuberculosis, the factors that are important there, as you know, are whether or not they are sputum smear positive, whether or not they're coughing, whether or not they have lung cavities. Now we know in HIV patients that sometimes cavities don't form early on, and yet some of these patients are infectious, and there are reports of patients who are smear negative who transmit as well, and certainly cough isn't always prominent. But nonetheless, those are the recognized factors associated with being infectious. The most important which is not being diagnosed and not being on treatment. We'll get to that. So then the organisms are released into the air, almost always indoors, in terms of ability to transmit. It is possible that transmission occurs outside, but it's very difficult to document that. Dilution is our friend. The organisms get really rapidly diluted outside and indoors as well, but the possibility for dilution indoors is much less. So in the environmental space, crowding, I marked ambient CO2, and that is not by itself a risk factor for tuberculosis and isn't listed as such, but it is an indicator of rebreathed air fraction. That is, in the indoor space, the more CO2 there is, more indication is that there are a lot of people who are the source of CO2 and relatively little dilution. So it's a kind of a mix of the amount of people and the amount of ventilation. So in the box, well, we'll get to the interventions momentarily. Another factor that has to do with the organisms in the air are the number of them. So how many infectious patients there are, the viability in the air, of course, and how virulent they are, and whether or not they're resistant to treatment. And then we get over to the host, and that's the people who are exposed, of course. And factors there include how immune people are innately. Some people are much more vulnerable to tuberculosis than others. Prior exposure and low-grade infection, if you will, repeated infection, conveys a certain amount of protection that can be overcome and is overcome frequently but nonetheless, there is infection. BCG provides some protection from infection as well as disease. And then there are factors that decrease protection, obviously, HIV, diabetes, etc. And then the cycle is completed by the infected host through pathogenesis developing into another infectious case. So now I'd like to just review in general, and we'll go into them in detail, the interventions. So in terms of infectious source strength, we want to reduce that. And again, the most important thing to do is to find those infectious cases by active case finding and get them on prompt effective treatment. Effective is important because if you treat MDR tuberculosis with drug-susceptible TB treatment, transmission will not be reduced. And so, and then much more crudely and temporarily, one can ask a patient with infectious TB to put a mask on. And we've shown and published that that's about 50%, 56% effective in reducing transmission. We published 56%, but when you consider that was under study conditions where people were encouraging patients to wear the masks as much as possible, in real life it probably is less than 50%, but something like that. But not useless, but not terribly effective either. And by the way, we'll get to the differences between respirators and masks, but for patients, we don't recommend respirators. We recommend surgical masks. In terms of the environment, ventilation is our major protection there. And we'll talk about the fact that increasingly in warm climates, windows are being closed because of terrible air pollution or because of air conditioning, and ventilation is becoming a problem even more than it was. And so we'll talk about germicidal UV as the only viable and sustainable alternative to ventilation, and I've listed that here. As I mentioned before, treatment, of course, stops this. Now, isolation is another thing we can do, is separate infectious sources from hosts, and we do that by separation or isolation. Again, you have to know about the patient to do that, and it is only necessary until effective treatment takes effect, and so usually not a long-term requirement. And then in terms of protecting the host, we sort of jump immediately to respirators for healthcare workers, a kind of mask that's designed to protect workers. But again, immunization, and there are new vaccines on the horizon. One published recently along with BCG, which was shown to prevent infection in adolescents. Sorry, I keep doing that. There we go. Okay, sorry. So immunization. And then, when people are infected, and we'll talk briefly about this, it's possible to treat latent infection to prevent this progression to disease and the completion of the cycle. So we'll come back to this diagram at the end as a summary, but basically it captures pretty much what we can do to interfere with this cycle of transmission, which is fueling the current epidemic. Now, traditionally, TB transmission control or TB infection control is presented a little bit differently as administrative controls, environmental controls, and respiratory protection. And those you heard me mention in passing. From the administrative control perspective, we were never given very much detail of what that entails, but it's the avoidance of exposure. So obviously separating a TB clinic or an emergency room from a newborn nursery or HIV clinic is an administrative control as well. But I think from a bigger picture perspective, what we've tried to emphasize is the FAST strategy, which is find cases actively, separate temporarily, and treat effectively based on rapid molecular DST testing. Why that approach? Well, it's really based on the observations that have been for the last 70 years that patients on effective therapy very rapidly become non-infectious. So if patients in the hospital who have known TB, most of whom hopefully are on effective therapy, become rapidly non-infectious, then the patients who are transmitting to other patients and to healthcare workers must be those who are undiagnosed or on incorrect treatment. So this approach gets directly at that issue. Find cases actively, separate them temporarily, and get them on effective treatment based on directly observed therapy so that they're on effective therapy. Now, that process, while it's conceivably done and done well for patients entering the hospital, it's hard to imagine in a busy ambulatory setting that active case finding will result in the diagnosis and effective treatment of patients who are there for a few hours, sometimes many hours, before they've already had a chance to expose other people. So there are many settings where environmental controls are the next backup strategy, and we've talked about ventilation, and we'll talk about GUV in passing. And then finally, given the fact that none of these first approaches, which are considered the most broadly applicable and effective, are perfect, then wearing a respirator, personal respiratory protection, is also indicated for, particularly for short-term use in high-risk settings. So doing a bronchoscopy, working in the emergency room with patients with unsuspected TB before they're diagnosed. And we need to make these distinctions between respirators and surgical masks to talk about fit testing and surgical masks on patients. Finally, although it's not commonly done in high burden settings anywhere in the world, testing healthcare workers and treating them, in the opinion of some of us, is something that ought to be done, especially for recently infected people who have sustained conversions. And we can talk about the methods for testing healthcare workers. There is some resistance to this idea in parts of the world, and yet others who, feel that they're entitled to be treated for tuberculosis infection and to prevent disease. So then how do we measure the outcomes? There'll be another whole webinar on this by Dylan Tierney, a colleague of mine, so I won't go into detail, but I would say the two approaches that have been discussed have been to look at either infection or disease among healthcare workers or process indicators, and those are particularly applicable to the FAST approach of administrative controls. And then in passing, and maybe this will come up as questions, there are other settings, obviously, other than hospitals and clinics, homes, for example, and what can be done, if anything, when exposure is 24/7. And we'll talk about that. So I'm going to jump right ahead into the effects of chemotherapy on transmission. We've made a big deal of the fact that treatment stops transmission, and I wanted you to see essentially where that came from. And this is a review done by Annick Rion from the Union, now 1976 published, and they conclude there's an ever-increasing amount of evidence to support the idea that the abolition of a patient's infectiousness, a different matter from cure, which takes months, and from negative results on bacteriology examinations, both smear and culture, which may take weeks, is very probably obtained after less than 2 weeks of treatment. Note the less than 2 weeks of treatment. 2 weeks was a very conservative number they pulled out of the air. There's not really much scientific evidence for 2 weeks. In fact, the evidence that does exist, I would suggest, is for much less than 2 weeks in terms of the effect of effective treatment on transmission. These facts seem to indicate a very rapid and powerful action by drugs on infectivity. And the study that really nailed this, I would say, was done by Richard Riley in the late 50s, early 60s, where patients in hospital beds exposed guinea pigs, which are highly susceptible to tuberculosis, in cages that were connected by the ventilation system to the rooms. So there were 6 patients in 6 rooms, in here, just one shown. The air was all ducted upstairs to guinea pig exposure chambers. And this was republished as Classics in Epidemiology in 1995. It's a little hard to find the original 1959, 60, 62 papers. This is Richard Riley. I knew him well, and a picture of his mentor, William Firth Wells, who really imagined this experiment and was responsible for its the idea that which Riley followed. Now, this is the data from Riley's study, and what happened here is that 61 patients with drug-susceptible TB who were untreated, exposed and infected rather, 29 of many hundreds of guinea pigs. And if that was 100%, that's how infectious patients untreated were. 29 patients who were treated infected only 1 guinea pig. They were 98% less infectious. And with drug-resistant TB, they seem to be less infectious for guinea pigs, and the treatment also reduced transmission. Now, these were all small smear-positive patients, and the results, this 100%, is relative to the amount of time they were on the ward. What Riley said in 1962 was that the patients were admitted to the ward at the same time the treatment was initiated, and they were generally removed before they became sputum smear negative. Hence, the decrease in infectiousness preceded the elimination of the organisms from the sputum, indicating that the effect was prompt as well as striking. And he goes on to say that the drug-resistant patients, which is only isoniazid, streptomycin, and PAS, there's much less data to base a conclusion on. We'll come back to that. Now, we have recently been doing similar experiments in South Africa, and we recently showed that in patients with MDR-TB and XDR-TB who have failed treatment, that adding bedaquiline and linezolid did not have that immediate effect on transmission. At least in the first 11 days, we saw no difference in the number of guinea pigs who were infected by a group of patients with that, who were treated, 5 patients who were treated with bedaquiline and linezolid. However, in another experiment where we applied the NICS regimen for highly drug-resistant patients, we found complete suppression of transmission within that first 11 days. Now, again, the effect is probably much quicker than that, but we have to choose a window to look at these patients, and we've chose to look at them in about 11 days. So not all regimens are equally effective, although I have to say that the bedaquiline linezolid study shown here on the left was the first one where we've actually seen no effect on transmission, other than when we have treated, we've treated XDR-TB with a MDR regimen and saw no effect there either. So we published this as the rapid impact of treatment on transmission of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and Mario Riviglione and Paul Farmer are kind enough to write an editorial just emphasizing the point that treatment really stops transmission, even MDR-TB transmission, very quickly if the treatment is effective. So this led to the FAST strategy, which we published now back in 2015, about 5 years ago. And we've talked about what that implies. Finding cases actively and working with the hospital to expedite diagnostic tests and getting people on treatment within days. Victoria Lidvich, shown here, did such a study in Voronezh, Russia, and published it. And I should have shown that data, which shows that in Russia, where oftentimes a diagnosis of drug resistance was delayed, if you did that quickly with expert testing, you had a 78% reduction in the generation of MDR-TB from drug-susceptible patients who were being reinfected in the hospital. The first author on that paper is Miller, and Litvich is another author on the paper that came out in the last couple of years on the effect of implementing rapid drug susceptibility testing on the generation of MDR-TB. Now, I'd like to switch gears to the environmental world, and there's an interesting phenomenon going on. As mentioned, normally we depend on open windows for air disinfection in much of the world, not in cold climates. And that's one of the reasons why MDR-TB is such a big problem in former Soviet Union countries and cold parts of the world, where not only is diagnosis delayed, but there's very little dilution going on. But increasingly, in many parts of the world, air conditioning is being put in to deal with global warming and rising temperatures or severe air pollution. And most of them are the split system air conditioners where there's a wall unit, but no outside air is brought in. Here's the sales of air conditioning in India from 2010 to 2015, and it's only continued at a more rapid pace. And the red ones are the split system air conditioners, the most popular kind of highly efficient air conditioning. But to be efficient, the windows have to be closed, and that immediately results in what I would estimate to be a 4 or 5 times increase in the probability of transmission. So here are the countries in the world who are going to need the most air conditioning. Don't worry about the terminology here, cooling degree days. And India tops the list. We've been hearing about extreme air pollution in New Delhi, and but also high temperatures throughout India. But many other countries are on the list of requiring very high numbers of cooling days. And then the other thing is the per capita income comes in here, because you have to be wealthy enough to afford air conditioning. And then what I put onto this table, which wasn't in the original, was the TB incidence in 2017. And you see that some of the highest TB rates in the world are in the same places where the windows are being closed and air conditioning is being installed. The only countries in here where there's a lot of increasing air conditioning is United States and Mexico, where the rates are relatively low compared to the rest of the countries on this list. Brazil being in between, but not low. We did a little experiment in South Africa where we asked 5 colleagues to occupy an office, and the window was open, and we measured CO2 with a fan on to mix the air. And so we're generating CO2 from these 5 individuals, and it's being diluted by natural ventilation. And that's what you see in this first period here, going from about 500 parts per million to about 700 or 800 parts per million, which is what happens when indoors. That's fine. Then we asked the occupants to leave. We allowed the CO2 to go back to baseline. We now close the windows and turn on the air conditioning. And 1 hour, you see that the CO2 level skyrockets as people continue to breathe in that room, and there's no more outdoor ventilation. And in an hour, the rates of CO2 doubled, the risk of TB would have doubled, and in several hours, it probably would have gone up 4 or 5 times. So this is a paper which you're seeing in draft form, which will be coming out in the next few weeks in Indoor Air, talking about how climate change is increasing the risk of indoor air pollution, indoor air transmission, not only of tuberculosis, but influenza and measles, for example. So that brings me to germicidal UV. If you close windows, there aren't very many options available in much of the world. There are so-called room cleaners, room air cleaners, which filter air. And the problem with those devices, and there are many of them with all different kinds of configurations, and the salespeople will tell you that and show you data where contaminated air goes in one end and purified air comes out the other. What they don't tell you is the clean air delivery rate, the actual flow rate through that device, which has to be quite high to achieve high levels of room air changes. So I'll show you an example in a moment of a sales device that was promoted in a conference I was attending in South Africa, and you'll see what I mean. So natural ventilation is essential, it's perfect for outdoor waiting areas and comfortable climates, but in cold climates, it's not possible, and in very hot climates, as discussed, it's increasingly not possible. So GUV could be the ideal complement or replacement for ventilation, and has its limitations, and I'll discuss those barriers in a moment. So this is a so-called air cleaner, which we're not recommending. Natural ventilation is the first choice. Mechanical ventilation can be done, but in many parts of the world doesn't exist or doesn't function very well. Room air cleaners, and finally, although I put this at the top of the list after natural ventilation, is upper room germicidal ultraviolet air disinfection. And here is one such fixture intended for the wall with these louvers keeping the UV lamp light above the eye levels of people below. So here's that example. Here's a fictitious room, 4 meters by 4 meters by 3 meters high, a small room. And a room air cleaner was advertised at a meeting that, when we looked very carefully, it was producing 60 CMF, a clean air delivery rate, or 28.3 liters per second. In this small room, that's just 2 air changes per hour. You just divide that volume by the volume of that room by the amount of air that's coming out in metric terms. And that's assuming optimal performance, that there's no short circuiting, that is air that was just filtered being filtered again. But if it was perfectly mixed and working optimally, you get 2 air changes. If we put an upper room UV light in that room and did it properly, the same room, we would produce the equivalent of approximately 20 to 24 equivalent air changes. Much more than you can do with an air cleaner. Even you'd have to put 10 air cleaners in that room, which is absurd to achieve that, and comparable to what you can get with outside ventilation if the air is moving outside. So again, the principle here, excuse me, is that warm air floats up into the upper room by convection, or can be mixed with a ceiling fan, which we recommend. And an upper room fixture like the one you saw disinfects that air above people's heads. The reason it's so much better than an air cleaner is that it irradiates a large volume of air at once in the upper room. And the air mixing between the upper room and lower room throughout the entire area of the room is also more efficient. So Grigory Volchenkov and Paul Jensen did a study in Vladimir, Russia, where they actually introduced contaminated air with bacteria and showed the efficiency of mechanical ventilation, 3 different air cleaners, and upper room germicidal units like the one shown in the picture here in terms of clearing the infection in that air. And they found that if you used, and this is the cost per in dollars per air change for these 3 interventions. You see the most expensive was a very expensive air cleaner designed for a space shuttle in Russia, and other air cleaners were equally expensive, as was mechanical ventilation in that cold climate. But UVGI was very, very low. And so in terms of efficiency, UVGI is about 10 times or 9.4 times more efficient than ventilation or any of the air cleaners in terms of air cleaning efficiency. So there have been a lot of problems, and I'm just about done, with getting UV installed. It's not a technology that people know about, so there's a lot of doubt, there's a lot of mystery around how this device works and how you know it's working. So we do now have a number of 3 actually experimental studies done in hospitals where we've shown approximately 80% effectiveness. Another barrier has been fear. So people are afraid of germicidal UV, but I will show you in a moment. It's quite safe if properly installed and maintained. Even the term irradiation, germicidal irradiation, causes fear. So we now just call it germicidal air disinfection. So we use GUV, germicidal air disinfection, instead of UVGI, but it's the same thing. It is quite safe. The exposure to sunlight outside is much more of concern, and yet we deal with that every day. We now have very practical dosing guidelines, and there is growing expertise to plan, install, and maintain these fixtures. In a project in India, we are negotiating with a company, ServiceMaster, which does a lot of maintenance in general in hospitals, and they're being trained to do upper room germicidal installation and maintenance, because you can't depend on hospitals to maintain pretty much anything, but anything unusual, even if it's not complicated, is likely to fail. Fixtures are being made locally in India and many other places now in cooperation with companies that know how to make them. You need to have a UV meter to be able to monitor it, or the company that's maintaining it needs to have meters. You need to have electricity. There needs to be air mixing, so we often suggest low velocity ceiling fans that are commonly found everywhere in the world. You need maintenance, as mentioned, and you need there is some cost involved in installation, but as I showed you from the study in Russia, GUV is by far the least expensive alternative to natural ventilation. And it needs to be sustainable. This cannot stop working in 2 years, and that can be done with proper maintenance. Again, we published our study and our guidelines in a paper that you see here, and I'm not actually seeing the citation, but it should be easy to find online. I have to revise that slide to put the citation there, but it's called Institutional Tuberculosis Transmission, first author Mufaleli, and I'm the last author on this paper where we showed 80% effectiveness of upper room germicidal UV. In terms of safety, again, the only exposure in the lower room is what bounces off ceilings, and with properly designed fixtures, we can minimize that. Low levels of this kind of UV, which is much less damaging than sunlight, is well tolerated, and it's really not a health issue at all. The only serious complaints we've had are when the fixtures are put in improperly, or for example, someone climbs up on a ladder to paint or to maintain this fixture and doesn't turn it off and looks directly into it. That can cause some eye irritation. All right, one last thing on the problem of testing and treating for tuberculosis. WHO has argued that we're not going to achieve TB elimination by the year 2035, which is the plan if we don't begin treating latent TB infection in the general population. And recently there's been a lot of controversy over a couple of papers by Marcel Baer and other colleagues arguing that, a lot of the skin test positivity we find, if it's been around for a while, particularly in low burden settings like the United States or Europe, may represent old infection, which is no longer likely to reactivate. So he's talking about revisiting the timetable of tuberculosis. But the other side of that coin is that most TB that we see is a result of progression or reactivation within the first year. So it really throws emphasis on the importance of frequent testing if you're going to test healthcare workers, and testing people who go from negative to strongly positive within a short time. And if you do that, I think one is both using resources wisely and really addressing people at high risk of developing disease. So the traditional teaching is that tuberculosis frequently establishes latent infection and the reactivation can occur anytime over a long incubation period. Bear and colleagues suggest that the incubation period of TB is typically several months to 2 years, most often within a year, and after that is relatively infrequent. And we also don't see a spike in reactivation in old age as we commonly thought happened. And even when people are immunocompromised, many who have been infected for a long time do not develop TB. So the TB sometimes seems to be self-cured. Reinfection, however, is an important pathway in high burden settings. Here we see the classical infected once and then stay dormant for a long time, and then something happens to cause bacteria to multiply in the body and reactivation, some immunosuppressive event occurring later in life or within the first couple of years. That's one scenario, but another one that probably is very common and hard to document in developing world is re-exposure, 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 and finally progression of one of these recent infections rather than original infection as a result of reinfection over the years. Now, the important thing to know is that once you've had TB infection, you are somewhat protected against reinfection, and vaccines do that as well, but not 100% protected. So in terms of LTBI treatment, we would prioritize those recently infected within the first few years and close contacts, recently arrived from foreign-born countries in the case of the United States or Europe. Those who are immunosuppressed or recently exposed and infected. Larger reactions are more likely to be sustained, and other risk groups are also diabetes, etc., are immunocompromised, but mostly the recently infected folks, recently arrived folks. Does treating TB infection reduce the protection from reinfection? And the answer to that is no reason to believe that that's true. It's a commonly asked question. So treating infection does not get rid of that protection. And likewise, does treating latent infection generate drug resistance? And there are multiple studies here that suggest that that is not the case, either with ifinatamab, this is courtesy of Dick Chason, or with rifampin as well. No significant increase in rifampin resistance by using rifampin to treat. And this is because the population of organisms is thought to be small when we treat latent infection. So this is my summary slide. The understanding of TB infection is changing. Most reactivation is in the first few years. Oftentimes, infection does not persist. And I would also conclude that rifampin-based regimens are better tolerated, better accepted, but majorly limited by drug-drug interactions in older folks who are on other medications. So this is this place we started, talking about infectious sources, what can be done there, environmental air disinfection and the problem of increasing air conditioning, and finally host resistance and the need for protecting people, vaccines certainly, and the treatment of latent infection as well. And with that, I'll stop and we can open that for question, Niraj, if that's okay.
Thanks, Ed, for an excellent overview of infection control. So we'll go ahead and ask for questions from our participants. So you have two options, right? You can just put those in on the sidebar. So any questions so far? Do we have any? Sorry.
We don't have any questions.
So I don't see any questions from any participants.
I said some pretty controversial things.
Oh, I haven't. There's a hand raised. So Olga, please go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. So can you just unmute her?
Yeah.
So Olga, you can go ahead when we have unmuted you. Olga, could you please go ahead and say what you have to say?
You may have some microphone problems.
Maybe. Olga, if you're unable to speak, feel free to send a Q&A or enter into the chat box as well.
She's saying thanks. Can you type a question, Olga?
I'm writing to her.
Niraj, are we able to see responses from participants if I ask?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
You should be seeing there's a sidebar with everyone there. But we do not have any questions.
Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask some questions if they're not going to ask questions.
So why don't you ask a question to yourself?
No.
Oh, we have a question actually,
Okay,
Ed. One question came in from Rubambi. What do you think it will take for widespread implementation of TBIC? We have evidence and guidelines, but implementation is
It's a
weak.
problem, yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess that's the question I would least like to see, because I don't think we have really any good answers. But let's talk about that, and I would invite Ravandi to express her opinions as well. So she's absolutely correct. We've had guidelines for a long time now. We've revised the WHO guidelines. We, just to go back historically, in 2006, when we had I think it was a 5-year plan proposed by WHO, I carefully went through that document at a union meeting and couldn't find infection control mentioned or transmission mentioned in it. So we've come a long way. Transmission and infection control is a commonly talked about, but the implementation has been weak. And URC, USAID has been very active in training and in making resources available. We've implemented a number of projects around FAST. But the thing is that you can do that with outside money, but that's not sustainable. We need to people have to own this, and it's really challenging, because one has to choose between, in some cases, using resources for treating patients, improving clinics, getting drugs, and this less visible, less pressing issue of ongoing transmission, new cases that may have occurred in the hospital, but not so obvious. And so I think, it takes an awful lot of belief that this is an important undertaking. Now, TB Proof, for example, in South Africa, is a grassroots effort by young doctors to sort of demand that something be done about transmission, and I think that's important. And Ravandi, yourself have been very instrumental in that movement as the vice chair. Now, WHO has felt that if we measure it and report it, that would help motivate people. That just like they report the completion rates of TB treatment, if we reported the rates of healthcare worker infection or disease, that would be an important motivator, put everybody out there in terms of how well we're doing it. And the problem is, and I didn't get into this, is that measuring the efficacy of TB infection control is quite difficult. WHO has recommended counting cases and comparing the cases among healthcare workers to that in the general population, and suggesting that it should be no higher than the general population. And recently we've looked at some of that data, and for example, the data reported from China, and China is not alone, of TB among healthcare workers is about 1/3 of what we think the rate is in the general population. Now we know that China is not implementing TB infection control so assiduously, if at all. So what it means is that the data, there's underreporting of healthcare worker tuberculosis, and there's a lot of reasons why that should be. Confidentiality, people, the stigma of tuberculosis, people don't want to be known to have tuberculosis. So counting cases and comparing it to the general population is a problem. But this getting back to Ravandi's question of what can we do to move this, I think dedicated funds for TB infection control with performance expectations in terms of process indicators, I think would go a long way. Now, we're often told that administrative controls are the most effective and most cost-effective, and I've suggested that FAST among administrative controls makes the most sense because you're getting at the unsuspected cases. That is measurable. How long does it take from a time a patient who ends up being diagnosed with TB enters a facility before someone considers tuberculosis, gets a sputum, gets a result, gets the rapid drug susceptibility test, and puts the patient on therapy? That can be measured in days, weeks, months, and in places where it's been done, for example, in Russia, it can be dramatically shortened, and so the infectious period of unsuspected patients becomes dramatically shortened. And even without looking at the actual reduction in transmission, one can believe that TB infection control is being well implemented. So if we were to look at such process indicators, that too could motivate people to try and improve them. But I think Ravandi raises a tremendous problem of how to motivate the acceptance. And again, not to be negative, we've made enormous strides. TB transmission control is talked about, and we are seeing uptake of environmental controls in appreciation of ventilation and of upper room germicidal UV. We are seeing use of respirators, but it is certainly not being done everywhere and universally. So I want to stop there and ask Ravandi if she has some comments, or anyone else who's on the call.
Thanks, Ed. I will mention just briefly, I don't think that there are easy answers to this question, because I spend a lot of time like you thinking about this. One thing I've been thinking about a bit more recently is a lot about how we do TB transmission control away from donor funding, whether it's research funding or USAID funding, Global Fund, etc. And I think one thing I have been thinking about is how to really build the stakeholder engagement from the administration level at the NTP, but then also at the facility level, as well as this. I think what we've identified is health workers are very aware of the gaps. I think there's much more awareness about environmental controls and personal protective equipment. I think there's probably still not enough focus on administrative controls like FAST and how they can be measured. And so I've been thinking a lot about how to get buy-in, and whether trying to work alongside other initiatives like other sort of overall infection control, or sort of making safe workplaces, not more broadly, not just from a one disease perspective. But I would love to hear other people's thoughts on this.
This is Raj from TB Care 2. I think I fully agree with Ravandi, which is we do need to look at broaden the focus, because NTPs have limited resources, and they also look up at broader Ministry of Health initiatives, but then also ministries of finance or treasury that allocate resources. Because right now, a lot of infection control is either driven by donor funds, whether it's Global Fund, whether it's USA. And I think as part of the broader health system strengthening, we do have to look at that infection control, whether it's for TB or other emerging infectious diseases. As you know that we have had outbreaks in many hospitals in many parts of the world because in general there are issues with infection control. So we do have to look at it how we link TB infection control, even though still focusing on TB, but still making sure it's part of a larger effort rather than just an island in itself.
In that regard, Niraj, this is Ed Nardell again. This focus on what's happening with indoor environments with global warming is such a motivator because it really should engage influenza. It should engage influenza governmental efforts. It should engage also the measles outbreaks that are occurring around the world are also airborne and spread indoors. So I think you're right in terms of a broader appeal, but also, you know, I think the issue is that we in tuberculosis are the most focused on where it's coming from and how it can be stopped, and we can't expect that generalists are going to necessarily have quite as much passion for this.
Go ahead. Any other questions or comments?
I still want to know what Olga was going to say.
Yeah. Let's see if she's going to say anything. She's not there.
Okay.
Olga is unfortunately no longer available.
All right.
All right, so with this, we would like to thank the participants as well as Ed for conducting the webinar. We will have another one coming up in a few weeks' time. We'll send out a note about it. So thank you very much.
And
yeah, sure.
Please find the recording and the presentation of this webinar along with all the other webinars TBCare2 is hosted on tb.academy. If you have any issues, please feel free to email us at tbcare2webinars@urc-chs.com. Thank you so much, Ed, one more time, and to all the participants and attendees. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Could you send me that link to the Academy? Thank you.
Yes, I can, Ed.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.